What's up, Flick Connection? This is Darren, and today we're going to talk about bad movies. More specifically, are movies worse today than they were yesterday? It's a perception a lot of people have. You may have had it yourself, that movies used to be really good, and for whatever reason, today they're just mostly crap. My argument's going to be that that's always been the case. That in any given year, when you go back and look at the calendar, you're only really getting a handful of really good, solid movies with staying power, and the rest are junk. We just don't remember those movies. They don't get reprinted. They don't come out on DVD or streaming. They essentially just get forgotten with time. So without any further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to show you some stuff. The 1970s are considered by many people to be the golden age of cinema. You might disagree. You may have a particular decade that you specifically identify with. Nowadays, you're getting a lot of retro 80s stuff. It will largely have to do with when you're born, but also sort of what type of movies you were introduced to when you were younger, who introduced you to them. So you may have a decade that you identify with. So we're going to exclude nostalgia from this discussion because that's personal preference, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that that particular decade put out more good movies. It just means you particularly like movies from that decade. So we're going to exclude that from the argument, and we're essentially going to look at numbers. We're going to look at how many movies in a given year or decade had really high ratings or still hold really high ratings today. A good example for me is 1975. That's the year Jaws came out. You look at the list of movies that were released that year, you get Jaws, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Barry Lyndon by Stanley Kubrick, Dog Day Afternoon, and Death Race 2000. You know, those kind of stand out. To me, only about 10 of them really stood out as memorable movies, and one of them is Death Race 2000, which is not a good movie. It's a cult classic, it's really enjoyable, it's one you can watch a bunch of times, but it's not considered a good movie and would not have been considered a good or even much less a great film when it came out. Given the way that IMDb works, Rotten Tomatoes, you get sort of a collection of reviews from users and professional critics, and they all get aggregated together and you get some form of a score. Rotten Tomatoes does a percentage, Metacritic does something similar where they'll do a number from 1 to 100, and IMDb for user ratings will give it a 10-point scale, and you'll get, you know, a 6.7 or a 7.3. But they're all essentially the same, but they're sometimes pulling those reviews from different sources, but they're still compiling a lot of reviews. So when you look at that, it gives you a good feeling of how good that movie might be on a grand scale. We could look at IMDb, and let's take any year from the 40s, and you're going to get roughly 2,000 movies, give or take. But what we see is, we look in the 1940s, we see about 2,000. You look at that list, and you're only going to really know of, even really good film buffs, unless you know that particular year or that decade really, really well, 10, 12, maybe 15 movies are going to come to mind at best. And when you look at the list, you might be lucky if you even recognize 20. Forget about them even being good. So you're only going to really see maybe 10 to 15 good films to come out any given year in 1940, during the 1940s, during the 1950s. And I think most people would say that that's still the case today. Just pick this past year, 2016. It's 2017 right now. The Academy Awards are coming up in a couple of weeks. There's only really a handful. If you look back at 2016, you can maybe count 10 movies that you really, really like, that you want to watch multiple times, maybe 15. And that goes for any genre. You know, you may be a big horror buff. there's only a couple of really good horror movies that come out, and then you might like movies from a couple other genres. And I think most people would say that's pretty consistent, unless you just have a really low bar for what you consider to be a good movie. There's only going to be 10 or 15. When we look back at the past decade, so let's not even look at the past 10 years, let's just look at the noughts or the aughts, the 2000s, the first decade in the 2000s. Which I don't know that it ever got an official title, but I've heard the noughts is something people call it. So let's go with that. That decade put out a ton of good movies, but it's not necessarily considered a golden age of cinema. But that decade gave us No Country for Old Men, There Will Be Blood. Both of those were filmed simultaneously in Plano, Texas the same year, came out the same year. Those are both movies that people will be watching decades from now. Just recently, there was a list of the top movies made in the 21st century. On the top of that list was Mulholland Drive. That was made in that decade. The Dark Knight, Kill Bill, Memento, The Departed, City of God, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Lost in Translation. The entire Lord of the Rings trilogy was in that decade. In foreign films, Old Boy, which has picked up a lot of steam over the past several years. The Royal Tenenbaums, Amelie, for another foreign film. So you can see that that decade is packed full of great movies, but even so, we only got a couple of good ones each year, and the rest are all stinkers. If you go to the movies regularly, if it's a Friday night, if it's a weekend thing where you're either going to the movies or renting a new movie like me, every week, that's 52 movies a year. 40 plus of them are stinkers, and you're gonna see maybe one a month if they're coming out regularly that are really good. What's the point? What do you do with that information? Well, basically, you just try to avoid crappier movies. Why waste time watching something that's less than? And that goes for everything. There's new movies coming out every week. Why watch one that's got low ratings, that no one's going to remember, that you're not going to remember 2 months from now, when you can watch Halloween again and maybe see some stuff that you didn't notice before? I post stuff on these movies all the time on my Instagram account. You could look up a little bit of information, find out some fun facts about the movie, watch it again. It's a totally different experience the more you know about some of these really good movies that have stood the test of time. So what my recommendation is, find a reviewer you like. Chris Stuckman on YouTube, he's one of my favorite YouTube channels. He's got really great opinions about movies. I see eye to eye with him on a lot of stuff. So if you like my opinion on things, you'll probably like his reviews. But for the most part, I go with those aggregate scores that I was talking about at the beginning. I've learned over time kind of where my sweet spot is with stuff. I know if something's over 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, I'm probably going to like it. Unless it's just in some far-off genre that I don't identify with at all. But the same can be said for low scores. If something's below, a little bit below 50%, I might still like it if I really like the look of the trailer, just the general themes it deals with, who's in it, who directed it, do I like their other stuff, I might like it. For the most part, I'm not really forking over money for things that just kind of suck. So I hope you like my first video. This is my first official video. I'm going to be doing more like it. So please, please, please comment. Of course, like and subscribe, but comment. Let me know what you like. Let me know what you didn't like. If I'm talking too fast, getting too sweaty, let me know in the comments. I'm going to try to improve these videos. I'm going to start to involve you because I want to build a community with Flick Connection. So it's gonna largely depend on what sort of feedback you give me. This channel may look completely different in a couple years. And that'll all be thanks to you. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.